So this is our first animation exercise. What we're going to do is take this sphere and try to animate it into a perfect circle, or as close to perfect as we can get. We'll be doing this by using the graph editor on two axes. So we've got the x-axis, which is the left and right, as well as the z-axis, which is the up and the down. So obviously we'll be working in the graph editor. I'll show you how to manipulate some keys and move them around in time on the dope sheet, and I'll also introduce you to a few tools, one of the main ones being the motion path. So that'll help us manipulate this ball and get it to do exactly what we want. So let's get started. So this is what the file will look like when you first open it up. Obviously the biggest window that we have open is the 3D viewport. This is where we'll be moving our ball, positioning it in 3D space, and that's why it's the biggest window here, so we can actually see what we're doing. Below that we have the action editor. Here we'll be moving some keys around in time. Underneath that we have the timeline. This is a good place to scrub forwards and backwards in your animation, as well as setting the start and the end frame. And on the very bottom right we've got the automatic keying, which I'll show you how to set up in a moment. Then our final editor that we have open is the graph editor. At the moment it's quite small and non-usable, like we can't really work in here, there's not enough space to work with, but I'll show you a quick and easy way that you can swap the positions of any of the windows, and that way you can maximize your screen real estate to only focus on one editor at a time. Alright, so what are we doing today? We'll be setting 5 keyframes. Our first one will be up here, our second one will be over here, our third one down the bottom, our fourth one on the left, and our fifth one will be in exactly the same spot as our first one here. And obviously we're going around in this direction. Now for the moment I don't know how fast I want this animation to be, so I'm going to start by putting 10 frames between each of these positions, and then later I'll show you how to adjust the timing and then clean it up. So let's start the animation. I'll just delete my grease pencil there. Now when you're doing animation you have to set a lot of keys. Now to do that in Blender you hit the I key and then you choose the keying set that you want to set the keys on. Now this is quite cumbersome, and for this example we're only using the location. So what I'm going to do is set up the automatic keying. This is a faster way to work. Because we're only working with the location today, it's not going to cause us any issues. So to turn on the automatic keying we're going to hit this little red button on the timeline, and then we get this little double key option here. We're also going to activate this one. This will tell Blender to only insert the keys for the keying set that we have set in this input box. Now at the moment it's empty, so it's going to set keys for everything that it has available, but because we're only working with location, I'm only going to choose the location. So now when I grab our ball with the G key in the 3D viewport and position it, you can see it's set some keys for the location only. Alright, so I'm going to start working really rough, and then I'm going to tidy it up later. I'm going to show you a couple of ways that you can be more precise when you're working. So I'm going to grab our ball with the G key, and just using my eye and the grid, going to position it at the top here on frame 1. And then I'm going to go 10 frames forward. So we started on frame 1 and we add 10 frames. That will be frame 11, so I'm going to position our ball on the right on frame 11. Our automatic keying has set keys in that position. Go to frame 21, position it down the bottom there, just using the grid, and then 31 on the left. And finally, on frame 41, we want it to be exactly the same as the first frame. So what I'm going to do is just select this first key, and then hit Shift and D, and drag it to our position over here. So now I know that our first and our last position will be exactly the same. So let's play the animation and see what we've got so far. I'm just going to hit the Alt A, and then we can see, oh, it's somewhat circular, but there's two major problems that we can see. The first one is that it's kind of moving more in a diamond shape rather than a circle, and we've also got a lot of dead frames on our animation here. So I'll show you a quick way that you can get rid of these frames. Because our start and our end is going to be exactly the same, we don't want that keyframe to repeat. So we're going to end our animation one frame before that. So I'm just hitting the left arrow to make sure that it's one frame before our end, and then I'm hitting the E key with the mouse over the timeline, and that's changed our end frame here. We can also just drag this one or type in frame 40 into the input there. So now when I play the animation, you can see that our start and our end is in the right spot. Now let's have a better look at what's going on with our motion. So I'm going to show you the motion paths tool. So with the object selected, I'm just going to go over to the object buttons, and then down near the very bottom there's the motion paths tab, and by default it will be set to start on frame 1 and end on frame 100. That's okay in our case because we're only ending on frame 40. So I'm just going to hit calculate and then confirm, and you'll see now I've got a visual representation of precisely where our ball is on every frame here, and obviously our keyframes are highlighted and numbered because we've chosen those options down here. So that's pretty handy. So we can actually see that the path is not very round. So it's time to fix our motion. I'm going to be switching over to the graph editor now, but as I said earlier, this isn't big enough to work with. So I'm going to swap the positions of these windows. I'm going to swap this window here with the one that's open on the bottom here. So with the mouse hovered over the very bottom left of the window, you can see that the cursor changes to a little crosshairs. I'm going to hold down the control key and then left click and drag with the mouse over this window, and it's going to swap the positions of those two editors. So now I've got more screen real estate with the one editor that I'm working on at a time. Okay, so it's time to tidy up these curves. And just before we go any further, I'm just going to give you a recap on what each one of these means. Now, the same hotkeys work in the graph editor as work in the 3D viewport. So I can grab with the G key, I can scale with the S key, and I can rotate with the R key. So if I just grab this and move it up and down, you can see that our blue curve is connected to our up and down motion, or the Z axis, and then our red curve is the left and the right motion. And you can see on the left here we actually have three. If I rotate my view around and then I grab the green curve here, you can see that is the forward and the backwards, which we don't actually want for this example. So I'll delete it in a moment, but I'll show you a nice easy way to remember which curve is connected to what value. Now with Blender we have the RGB, red, green, blue. That will always be the XYZ. So RGB equals XYZ. Red for X, green for Y, and blue for Z. That's a good way to always remember which one is connected to what. I don't need the Y location, so I'm just going to select it, and then with the mouse hovered over this section of the graph editor, I'm going to hit the X key and delete it. So it's going to reset my view back to the front position, and it's time to tidy up our curves. Now, what do I want these curves to look like? It's probably easier if I just work on one curve at a time. So I'm going to hide and mute our X location and just focus on this blue curve. I'm also going to add a curve modifier. So with the curve selected, I'm going to go down to the modifiers and then choose a cycle modifier. Now this is not something that you need to do. This just gives us a good visual representation of what our curve looks like when it repeats. And you can see that every time it crosses the x-axis, there's a little bit of a kink in the curve. Now let's kind of exaggerate what's going on here. So I'm just going to rotate this one around and then try and explain what's happening. So we're starting at the top here, and then we're going to cross the axis here, and you can see that it speeds up, it gets faster, and then it slows down and it speeds up again. So we actually don't want this motion. We want this to be nice and smooth through the middle. So I'm just going to rotate it with the R key and make it nice and smooth, and then do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so that's looking like a sine wave. So I'm going to do the same thing with our X curve. So I'm just going to unhide that, and just to make it easier, I'll add a modifier just for visual representation, also the cycle, just to visually help us see what's going on. So I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to tidy up this curve. So when it crosses the axis, I want it to be nice and smooth. And then I'm going to do the same for our start key here. Now you can see I've still got a little bit of a kink. And that's because our cycle starts here and it ends on the other side. But our two keys are different. we actually need these to be exactly the same if you want it to be a nice smooth connection. So what I'm going to do is just copy this key with the Shift D, and then with the mouse drag to the right, because at the moment the key can be positioned anywhere, but I want it to be in exactly the same value. So with the mouse moving in the right direction, I'm going to press the middle mouse button, and that's going to constrain the value to the x-axis of that view. And then I'm going to paste it over the top, and now our first and our last key is exactly the same. And one thing to note about our motion paths is that if we adjust the curves here, it doesn't actually update the motion paths. We have to manually do that with this little button over here. So when I press this, it's automatically going to adjust what I've done to the animation here. But if you grab our object in 3D viewport, it's automatically going to update. So that's just one thing to be wary of with the motion paths tool. If you grab the object in the 3D viewport, it will auto update. If you adjust the curves, you have to manually update. Okay, so now that's looking more circular, and it's repeating quite nicely, and we've done it. We've made our animation move in a circle. So now it's time to actually make this more precise, because you can see our values up here, and they're not very nice and tidy. They're all a little bit over the shop. So what I'm going to do is, on each specific key, I'm going to change the value. So I know that I want this to be right in the middle, which is when the X is 0. So I'm just going to click that and enter 0. Our Y, I'm just going to make that 0 for now. I won't have to adjust that later. And this Z value, which is the up and down position, I want that to be precisely 2 on our first keyframe. So I'm going to hit the 2 value there, and that's going to update it. Now you see that because I've adjusted the keys and I haven't actually moved it in the 3D viewport, that's the same thing as adjusting the curves by changing this value. I need to manually update our curves. I'll click that. You can see that it's adjusted. Now I'm going to go to the next keyframe just by pushing the up arrow. That's if you press the up and down arrow keys, it'll jump to the next key. And you can see that these keys are quite messy as well. So I want that to be on the X of 2 and the Z of 0. Jump to the next keyframe. Now I'm going to show you how you can do the same thing in the graph editor. So if I highlight this key and then I go to the F curve, you can see that I've got some values for my left handle, my right handle, and the key. So we're on frame 21, and I want that value to be 0. So I'm just going to type in 0 there, and then I'm going to select this key here, and you'll notice that this is nearly -2. So I want that actually to be precisely -2. So I'm going to type in -2, and I'll do the same for these ones. I'm going to highlight that key. That's going to be -2 on the X, and this needs to be 0. It's nearly 0, so I was close. And then our last keyframe is going to need to be exactly the same as the first. So I'm going to do a similar trick that I did before. I'm going to highlight these two keys. I'm going to do them both at once, and then I'm going to hit Shift D. And rather than constraining with the middle mouse, I'm just going to hit the X key, which is going to constrain it to the X axis. And then I'm going to paste it over the top there. And now I'm going to update my curves, and you can see that's a nice circular action. I can just prove that by hitting Alt A, and you can see, yes, now our object is moving in a nice circle. So what if I decide that this is now moving a little bit too fast? I want to slow it down. So what I actually need to do is insert some frames between each of these positions. So I'll do that in the action editor. So I'm just going to switch back now. So I'm going to drag that with the Control left drag. And essentially, there's a couple of different ways that we can add some extra frames. So what we can do is select our keys and highlight them with the box select, and then G, move them around with the G key. But that's quite cumbersome, and you need to be more precise. We can actually scale them. If I press the S key to scale, you'll notice that they do scale. Now the way the scale works is it's relative to where the cursor is. So if I scale it from that position, they will move away from wherever the cursor is. If I'm at the end, they'll scale back towards the other direction. But there are a few issues with scaling the keys. If I scale from the start here and move the mouse quite slowly, you can see that our keys aren't moving at the same time. This can cause some issues. So say, what if I choose this value here? Now there isn't an even number of frames between each of these positions. So now we have 12 frames between our first one, 11 frames, 12 frames, and 11 frames. So you can see that it's not even anymore. So there's one other tool that I wanted to introduce you to, and that is the shrink and the extend tool. Now you activate this with the key selected, you hit the E key, and whatever side the mouse is on the cursor, it's going to affect those keys. So if the mouse is on the right side and I hit the E key, you can see it's going to move all of these keys evenly on that particular side. If the mouse is on the left, you can see that it's going to move all of those ones. Now you might be thinking that this isn't a very intuitive tool, but it's actually very, very handy. So I can, if I wanted to add 5 keyframes between here, with the cursor in between those keys and the mouse on the right hand side, I can hit the E key, drag my mouse to the right until the value at the bottom left of the window says 5, and then confirm with the left mouse button. I can also activate the keyboard when using this tool, so I can do it a lot faster. So I can hit the E5 click, E5 click, E5 click. Now you can see that I had precise control over how many frames I added between those positions, and I did it quite fast. But you notice now the end of our animation doesn't match the end of our keyframe. So I'm just going to quickly fix that by going to the frame before our end, hitting the E key, and I'm going to play our animation and see what's happened. Okay, so our motion paths look like it's circular, but when I play the animation, something looks a little bit weird. And that's because I need to update our curves because I've moved the keys around. And you can see what's happened. Yes, I've added some extra frames, so you can see that it's taking a lot longer to go around to each of these positions, but you can see that it's more of a rounded square. And that's because of the order that I've adjusted things. I've actually adjusted the handles of our curves before I've adjusted the timing. And that means that we need to fix those handles. So I'm just going to quickly switch back now, swap our windows around, and for this example it's not that difficult to fix. I'm just going to line up our curves again. So this needs to be nice and smooth, this one, and then copy that to the end, update our curves, and you can see we're back to being a circle. So I think that's all you need to know for now about animating our object into a circular path. It's not as easy as you might have thought, but don't give up if you run into a few problems. I've tried to recreate some of the issues that you may encounter, so hopefully those tips and tricks will help you overcome any of the problems that you might face. So good luck and happy animating!